Thanks very much, Tom. Okay, can we have the presentation up? This is Reason Foundation's biggest project currently, started about a year ago, and is very directly related to the subject of this organization and this conference, and that is mobility. Mobility in the cities where we live. We have this large-scale national project underway to try to focus on urban traffic congestion as a plague on the land, not as something that we should sit back and get used to because there's nothing we can do about it, but as something we must aggressively work to get rid of and use everything that we know about good transportation to do so. Okay. The project is called the Galvin Mobility Project because Bob Galvin, the retired chairman of Motorola, came to us with the idea for it and said he would fund it if we would do it. And that's hard to turn down, especially when his ideas seem very consistent with our ideas, very much wanting to use market mechanisms and an approach that says that this is a problem that's intolerable, should be seen as intolerable, and that we really have to mobilize efforts to fix. Next. This is just not going to work. We have a distinguished advisory board. You can't read those names, I'm sure, from where you're sitting, but they include Mary Peters, the former Federal Highway Administrator, who was just nominated by President Bush to be the new DOT Secretary, several heads of state DOTs, heads of other transportation organizations, and some of the nation's leading scholars and thinkers on transportation. Next. And the products will be, in broad terms, a whole series of studies, more than a dozen, on various aspects of mobility, including one by Tom Rubin, the moderator of the session, very detailed proposals for how to reduce congestion in specific metro areas, including Atlanta, where we are today. That project is basically done and will be released in about 6 weeks. A comprehensive overall recommendation for how to improve mobility in America, and a book, the co-author of which Ted Balaker, actually the two co-authors, Ted Balaker and Sam Staley, are both here at this conference, which will be out in about a week, which I highly recommend to you, that really summarizes the case for why we need better mobility and how we can actually get it. Next. So, congestion. The big problem is we're strangling congestion in America, and it's going to get a lot worse unless we change course. Next. Here is, in 1982, only one place in America had bad enough congestion that you would waste 40 hours or more per week sitting in your car stuck in traffic. Fast forward to 2003, and those are all the places that have become as bad as LA was back 2 decades before. And we don't have a map showing what it's going to be like in 2030, but another, Dave, is it another 15 metro areas will have LA-level traffic congestion by 2030 based on their existing long-range transportation plans and how they plan to spend the available transportation dollars. Next. So, okay, well, here it is. I anticipated the next slide. The congested lane miles in our cities will be 50% worse by 2030, and 11 more will have travel time indexes, the TTI, which means the ratio of the time it takes to get somewhere at rush hour compared to at non-rush hours. 75% worse is the way it is today in LA, which is the worst in the nation. But all of these other places will be at LA levels, including Atlanta, Miami, San Francisco, Seattle, etc., unless we change course, is the message. Next. Congestion, it doesn't just hurt us when we're stuck in traffic. All sorts of businesses on which the economy depends get hurt. Companies can't make as many deliveries. They can't, plumbers can't get to as many appointments. It's just, it really imposes, when you start adding it all up, it's amazing how much of a burden this imposes. Next. Blue-collar business, as I said, I mean, we have actual anecdotes, case studies from people, economists have now started to actually try to quantify this. There was just a big study done in Portland, of all places, Portland, Oregon, on the huge impact that congestion is already imposing on the business and economy of Portland, and how much worse that's going to be by 2030. Next. And white-collar workers, white-collar businesses, the same sort of thing. And congestion, is, I know, in the major metro areas in California is already, along with housing prices, two of the major factors that employers find if they're trying to recruit nationwide to get people to be willing to relocate there. You're asking them to accept a daily nightmare of congestion. But basically, if you can only get half as far in 30 minutes as was the case 20 years ago, that shrinks your circle of opportunities. It shrinks the circle within which you can accept a job. It shrinks as Ted in the book points out, it shrinks the circle in which you can go on a date and try to establish a relationship, because it's just such a hassle to ever get together. But also from the standpoint of a company, an employer that wants to find the best people to match with its job openings. If its circle of opportunity shrinks also, if people won't travel an hour or an hour and a half to get there, the number of people in a metro area that it can hire shrinks, and that means it will be less productive than if it had the pick of the best people. Next. Okay, there's the great graphics at work. Okay. So that's what happens to all these different aspects of the economy. Next. Mobility, on the other hand, does just the opposite, and for the same reason. The reason a metro area works and is productive, why do people cluster in cities? Because it creates increased opportunities. And mobility is key to having having a metro area be able to work well, to do what it's supposed to do, is to connect people. And a study in France looked at the relationship between mobility and economic productivity and found that when travel speeds increased by 10%, the labor market increased by 15%. And productivity was therefore up by a measurable 3%. So there's real economic consequences to mobility, whether you have it or whether you don't. Congestion, it affects all sorts of things. I mean, it affects your behavior on the road, and it has consequences in terms of accidents and so forth. It's not just the sitting stuck in traffic. Next. And very importantly, it slows down emergency care, and one of our speakers is going to address that in more detail. This is one of the things people often don't think about, people who think that, well, it's good to have congestion because it forces people onto transit. Well, the EMTs don't bring their gear on the light rail. Sorry, folks. Next. Now, the important point to realize, for the last 20 years, we have been told that we can't build our way out of congestion, that congestion is an aspect of a growing economy. It's a fact of life. Sit back, get used to it, equip your car with good music and stuff, because there ain't nothing we can do about it. But congestion is not the law of gravity. It's a function of policy choices that have been made in this country in the last 20 years, one of which is that we basically stopped building roads. Now, it's not literally true, but compared to the previous 20 years, the last 20 years, we have continued to increase driving at a huge pace, but the actual amount of highway lane miles has hardly increased at all. So if you try to put 10 pounds of potatoes in a 5-pound sack, you have a basic problem. That's what we're trying to do with the roadway system in recent decades. This is I put this together from some data from the Texas Transportation Institute. The cities in the top 5 there are the number of person hours of delay per traveler. These are some of the most congested areas in America. They have the least amount of freeway lane miles per 1,000 daily miles traveled. The places down at the bottom end that have very small amounts of congestion have much more capacity available for driving. So it is very clear, and there's all sorts of other statistical evidence, that those few metro areas that have tried to keep their highway systems growing, their highway capacity growing in pace with the growth in travel demand, have the least increases in congestion during this past 20 years. Next. So that's the basic message, that more capacity does equate to less congestion, despite everything that we've been told by editorial writers, by planners over the last 20 years. Next. And so the question then becomes, what do the agencies that create the long-range transportation plans, the MPOs, the Metropolitan Planning Organizations, how are they going to spend all of the transportation dollars that are available? The standard thing is to do a 25-year plan, so almost all the plans today are aimed at the year 2030. And what we have here are the LRTP, Long Range Transportation Plan, is the dollars that they have available. The second column there is the amount of that, the number of dollars out of that total that they plan to spend on improving the highway system. This is over the next 25 years. And you'll see that in the Boston metro area, they actually plan to spend 9% of the available transportation dollars over the next 25 years on improving the highways. San Jose, California, heart of progressive Silicon Valley, plans to spend 13% of its transportation dollars on highways. You want to guess what fraction of people use transit in Silicon Valley? About 2%. And yet that's how they're going to spend, that's how they now plan to spend the money. And so this is the top 10 most anti-highway. Washington, D.C. area is the least bad of this group, with spending only 40% of its transportation funds on highways. I think, do we have on the next, yeah, the next 10, just to give you some context, Los Angeles will plan to spend only 42%. This is not just capital costs, this is total dollars available in their long-range plans on maintenance, and most of that money on highways in Los Angeles is going to be spent on maintaining the existing system and adding a few more HOV lanes, not on basic expansion of the capacity. So we have a real problem. So what we have done, the first major release from the mobility project came out 2 weeks ago. David Hartkin, who is here, was the lead author of that study. We looked at, on a broad scoping basis, what would it take in terms of expanding the capacity of the highway system to catch up, basically, catch up only to the point of eliminating the very worst congestion, the level of what they call level of service F, when you're basically in real stop-and-go conditions. So the idea is to run through the traffic planning models enough additional capacity to the point where at the end the output shows there's no more, no lanes that are at that really extreme amount of capacity. And it turns out the cost of that is about $533 billion over the next 25 years, about $21 billion a year. The large majority of that would be in the biggest metro areas where the biggest problem is. Now this number sounds big and scary, but it's actually, it equates to about 28% of what the metropolitan planning organizations already plan to spend on transportation. And since many of them plan to spend the majority of their funds on transit and bike paths, if they reallocated the money, many of them could do what we're suggesting without any increase in money at all. And in other cases, you could obtain much of the rest from toll lanes and the funding that comes from that. So the point is that there are things we can do. The money problem is a real serious problem, and people believe when you propose that new capacity be tolled, people believe, well, you know, we pay lots of gasoline taxes. Why don't they just spend that wisely? Well, it turns out that urban expressway lane miles to build today cost $5 to $10 million if you have the right-of-way available. If you have to build them elevated, they may cost 15 to 30 million per lane mile. That's a lot of money, and it's way more than the gasoline tax produces. That's a plain fact. We need to come to grips with that if we're going to have significant expansion of capacity in places like Atlanta and Los Angeles and Denver and Phoenix, it's going to cost a lot more than the existing gasoline tax is likely to be able to pay for, and that's why we are going to need, in the workshop session that I'm speaking at later this morning, I'll talk more about the case for pricing new capacity, but let's go on. So the other question is not only how to pay for it, but how do you squeeze it in? People will say, the defenders of shifting the money to transit will say there's no more room for highway capacity. We can't just pave over the city. And I don't want to pave over cities either. But how can we fit in more capacity? One way is to look for specialized kinds of right-of-way like rail lines that could be used, power line corridors, innovative things where you couldn't put a whole 8-lane freeway, but you could put 4 lanes that are for cars only, for example. Also, you can build upward second decks and go under in key places, which is definitely more expensive, by tunneling. The picture there shows a sound tube, which is a structure built on an elevated private sector toll road in Melbourne, Australia, that provides much more effective noise buffering than a conventional sound wall. And this was a private sector innovation designed to make an elevated toll road more acceptable to the neighborhood through which it had to go. Next. Hot lanes, as was mentioned, is another very important part of this. We have wasted a fortune building carpool lanes that are not well used and that aren't a long-term solution to anything. But if we can turn those into variably priced lanes that can always be fast-moving and uncongested, we give people an escape valve that, in other words, we can turn this lemon of HOV lanes into lemonade that's useful for everybody. And where these exist, they are very popular. Plus, priced lanes that operate uncongested at high speed during rush hour also provide the ideal guideway for bus rapid transit. And yet the transit system doesn't have to pay a fortune for the infrastructure, because those of us who choose to have an electronic tag and pay the market price to use them provide at least most of the cost through the toll revenues to build those things. Houston is pioneering the first such project on the Katy Freeway, in which 25% of the capacity will be available for super high occupancy vehicles and buses, and paying customers will make up the rest. And the Houston's Toll Road Authority is financing and will operate that project. Next. So that makes the toll lanes, the priced lanes, the virtual equivalent of an exclusive busway, and yet you're not wasting all the rest of the capacity. An exclusive busway in most cases is empty most of the time because you don't have anywhere near enough bus demand to fill it up. But if you meter in vehicles that pay a market price and only allow enough in so that the road flows smoothly, you get dual use and a huge revenue boost, and so you really have a win-win operation. The bottom line here is that what we're doing in this project is making a serious case for policymakers to make reducing congestion dramatically a realistic policy goal for the next few decades. We're producing all sorts of new research that will bolster this case, that will help you as you want to work for these kinds of objectives. We're illustrating this with real specific examples in half a dozen metro areas of how you could actually do this kind of an approach and what meaningful, serious, large-scale reductions in congestion would result. And we're also then looking at what kind of institutional changes do we need so that the planning process doesn't work against mobility, but actually turns into something that works to improve mobility. And I think we're just about at the end. What have we got there? This is you won't be able to read this, but when you look on the CD, you'll see this is a preliminary list of all the different policy studies that goes on for several pages that will be in the project. And it's all on the Reason Foundation website, reason.org/mobility, and I welcome you to visit that, and we'll look forward to your questions. Thanks very much.
Bob has a quality that is very much needed in transportation, and you don't see very often in transportation projects, particularly rail transit projects. He actually came in ahead of schedule and within budget.